Alright, so some technical issues happened last night. And no one's here. Fuck. Hold on a sec. So, had some technical issues yesterday, and well, aside from my iPad camera actually dying because I use that as well the build cam here. Here's the issue. This thing's kind of weak. So, you've been attacked by your future self that's pretty much better than you. Now, what's the one thing that they have? Yeah, sure, they got a bigger sword. What's the one thing else that they have? Yeah, so fucking time to build Avalanche Exia and not just regular Exia, so you can just fuck off right here. On the side. Get rid of the short daggers, get rid of everything. One thing I didn't really explain yesterday was just how good this actually is. Like for a double O season 1 kit, this feels solid. God damn. That these joints okay, aside from the chest piece, these joints that hold in place whatever you do. Especially the legs. The legs are just nice. But that's not what we're here for. We're basically gonna be breaking this little bitch apart and we're gonna be making him into 1 second. Let's get to it. Okay, almost got myself a bit. It's kind of embarrassing. But yeah, so I'll just be playing some stuff for you guys to listen to while I get on with it. Hope you guys enjoy.
I was on my way to Canada to see family when the pursuit began. 13-hour drives are no joke. I've done 8-hour drives more than a few times, so I thought I'd be fine, but the mind starts to fray at 6, and I hit that agonized mental exhaustion only to realize I hadn't even gone halfway yet. It was 11:54 p.m. when I pulled into that rest stop. Past midnight my time, but just creeping up on it for that region of the world. And anti-noon is a very different thing out in the empty reaches of Middle America. Without the omnipresent haze of city light, the star-filled sky was a looming and crawling blanket on my awareness that seemed to possess parallax for the first time I'd ever seen. As I climbed out of my borrowed family van, stretched, scanned the silent and still darkness, and began walking warily and unsteadily toward the pool of light around the rest stop building, I had the strangest notion that I could sense the different distances of stars and even see them moving slightly. It was as if someone had hung the pinpoints of light nearly within reach, like the dome of a planetarium. I stopped right at the edge of artificial lighting that cut off the sidewalk into opposite shades, staring upward. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. At 11:57, by my watch, a strange, constant warm wind began to flow through the area. Silhouette walls of wood began to whisper and wave, outlined only by eerily close stars that seemed poised to hit the metronome treetops. This prompted me to move. Traces of vague fear slithered through the heavy fatigue on my senses, and I entered the rest stop's pool of electric light. The dark red sedan rose in the edge of my vision like a bubble emerging from the depths of a lake. It was already dark and silent, sitting in a spot at the opposite end of the parking lot, but it startled me with the realization that I was not alone here. I saw nobody on foot, so I figured they were either a maintenance man or already inside. Fixing my hair with a brief slide of my hand, I pushed through the heavy glass doors and into the small pocket of civilization the state built and maintained for drivers just like me. Yeah, there were security cameras over in that corner and a blue-lit phone stand for emergencies. I was fine. This was fine. The high clock on the wall hit midnight. The lights flickered briefly, and it occurred to me that this edifice of civilized safety could vanish in an instant if the power went out. I froze with my hand on the door to the men's bathroom and listened. Somewhere in the building, a radio or a phone had become audible, sending out one half of a conversation that was just poor enough in reception and echo so as to be indecipherable. The male voice coming from the phone seemed to be excited and fearful, practically shouting long strings of information to whoever was listening. I say listening because there was no break in the staticky shouting to indicate anyone was talking back. Was this a radio that someone had left on, or maybe a cell on speakerphone someone had dropped? If it was a cell phone, who had answered? Not quite sure why, I began to back slowly out of the building. The glass doors were heavy, but quiet, and I heard the urgent crackling speech fade as each door swung silently shut behind me. Back in the warm, constant wind, I walked back to my borrowed family van with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Now a safe distance, I looked back at the rest stop, and that is when I first finally saw it. It was in the men's bathroom. That much I knew instantly from the position of the tall, frosted window. An idea flashed into my awareness. The driver of the dark red sedan had been on his phone, had entered the men's bathroom and encountered it without warning. Whoever he'd been talking with had probably been frantically shouting over the line ever since. I nearly fumbled my keys, but got the van turned on and moving despite the vice-like grip of adrenaline on my limbs. There were no trucks in the wider parking lot. My phone was dead because I'd forgotten my charger. What to do? The next rest stop would have a blue-lit emergency phone. The rest stops were roughly 40 or 50 miles apart. Not long. It wouldn't be too long. But what would I say? What had I seen? How had I even recognized it as a monster? The creatures I'd always seen in movies were typically of a few different but very close types. Transmorphic like the Thing, smooth and bladed like Alien, twisted perversions from places like Silent Hill, or animalistic like a werewolf, but the shadow I'd seen had been of something else entirely. No cars, no gas stations, no exits, just endless dark highway. I hit the next rest stop at 12:45 a.m., and I jumped out and ran through warm, constant wind under those eerily close stars to reach these new heavy glass doors. I froze with my hand on the second handle and turned to look back. There, close to the middle of the line of car parking spots, was a dark red sedan. Was it the same one? I hadn't gotten the license plate the first time, but how had they gotten ahead of me? I hadn't seen a single car on the road. Had they driven past with their headlights off somehow? Different setup inside. It was a similar building, but with more corners. I clung to the brick wall and moved quietly. The high clock read 1 a.m., and the lights flickered briefly. I put my back to the brick wall next to the blue-lit phone and picked it up while watching the closed bathroom doors and entrance to the vending machine area. To my surprise, the phone was already active. A male voice said, I responded with, "Hello?" as well, completely taken off guard. "Who is that?" I said, cutting him off, then stopping myself as I heard his question. And I stopped, chilled as I realized I was hearing my own echo before I even spoke. My fingers clenched white around the phone as I stared at it from an inch away. This couldn't be real, could it? I needed to be sure. I let the idea spill down toward my mouth.
"Catchphrase,"
he said. I bit back the words as soon as I heard my pre-echo.
"You got me."
The voice said, humored. My blood ran cold. Somewhere in the building, that indecipherable voice talking over a radio or speakerphone rose once more, this time desperately shouting for a response. I moved toward the front, but then had a sudden notion. I'd gone that way last time. It felt hunted, and if it really was happening, my unknown pursuer would expect that. I went through the door to the women's bathroom instead, hurrying across. I rolled open the small window and slid out into the night. I shouldn't have done it, but I had to. I crept along the side of the building and peered around the corner. It was waiting out front beyond a curve in the sidewalk. Humanoid. Maybe that's the type of monster, but that doesn't do it justice. Imagine you could take the moments of a person's life and make them stand next to one another. Imagine you had a line of children, each older than the last by just a bit. That line becomes a line of teenagers, then adults, then old men, but all the same man. Now imagine yourself standing at the very beginning of that line and looking at all of them superimposed on one another, all visible, all transparent, all in different poses that overlay to form a century-deep blur whose elements you can somehow still tell apart if you stare hard enough. Now imagine that line starts not at birth, but at death, and the line starts with a corpse and ends with dirt and dust rotted down from ancient bones and maggot-filled flesh. A ghost? A zombie? An entity from outside of time? No wonder I couldn't identify it by a shadow in the frosted window. It was a walking timeline of death and decay, bound to a grinning, half-rotted skull. And that grin turned toward me as I stared. A cloud of 2 centuries of decomposing corpse slowly turned and began stepping in my direction. I ran. Luckily, my van was parked on this side. I reached it and drove away in a panic, watching my rearview mirror for the ghastly thing every other second. It just stood and watched me until I could no longer see it in return. No cars, no gas stations, no exits, just endless dark highway. With my foot on the accelerator the entire time, more than happy to get a huge speeding ticket if only it meant that I could find a cop. I hit the next rest stop at 1:54 a.m. Laughing darkly to myself in confirmation, I hopped out and checked the license plate of the dark red sedan parked in the dead middle of the row of spots. It was different, but so was the rest stop's architecture and layout. I'd seen enough Twilight Zones to not fall for it. The only difference was that this was actually happening, and my brain just kept running scenario after scenario, trying to understand how this could be explained away. The bubble of light around the rest stops no longer seemed inviting. I slunk in, gaze darting an alert, and picked up the blue-lit emergency phone. Not hearing a dial tone, I asked, "What do you want?" My heart sank as that same voice replied,
"I'm missing a piece."
And indeed, I knew what he meant. There had been one missing moment in the visible timeline of that decaying corpse entity, the one closest to still alive, the one that most human beings saw only in coffins at funerals. The thing following me was a ghost without a soul, a dead thing that had not yet found a living thing to be a part of. I asked the question burning at the forefront of my mind. Why me?
Isn't it obvious? I'm your future.
No. The phone began to creak under the force of my squeezing hand.
Yes. Did you think you were going to live forever?
I'm not dead yet! I screamed into the receiver. The voice on the other end paused before asking,
Am I early? Oh my, what time is it by your clock?
I looked up at the high clock on the wall. 2:05 a.m.
Shit, that's right. We're on a road trip. I've got the wrong time zone.
Its words initially brought me a spark of hope, but then I grew suspicious. What do you mean? When were you supposed to come?
We were supposed to die at 12:54 a.m.
The entity breathed, very concerned.
We fell asleep while driving and suffered a fatal crash.
This is Central Standard Time, I said, half hopefully, half angrily. You came an hour early. No way I'd fall asleep after that adrenaline rush.
So I'm your ghost, yet you didn't die.
The other continued.
Because I showed up an hour early, we should meet and talk about what to do.
While it seemed distracted, I dropped the phone and made a dash out the heavy glass doors and toward my van. It turned and tried to give chase, but I'd chosen the perfect moment. The van roared to life, and the headlights seared fire across its path. No cars, no gas stations, no exits. Just endless dark highway. I hit the next rest stop at 12:54 a.m. Central Standard Time, already darkly bitter about what I was to find. The dark red sedan was now nearly on the other end of the parking lot from where it had started. I didn't stop. I blew right on through. The radio crackled, and his voice came through on the static.
I can't let you go. You know that, right?
Go to hell! I slammed my hand down on the radio.
What?
No cars, no gas stations, no exits. Just endless dark highway. I hit the next rest stop at 3:54 a.m. Central Standard Time, with my gas tank nearly on empty and the sky showing zero signs of dawn. In this latest lot, the dark red sedan was at the furthest possible spot. There was no more running. My gas tank wouldn't take me to the next stop. I'd had ample time to think about it, however, and I eyed the dark red sedan that was somehow part of this mysterious battle of will. The 2 centuries of progressively decaying corpse was waiting right there in the rest stop's light and began stepping toward me. I picked up a rock and smashed the window of the dark red sedan. As I cleared away glass and reached down to open the passenger side door, the radio inside lit up and said,
Do you know what will happen if you do escape? I won't lie. Reality will pop open like a punctured balloon. Have you ever heard of a ghost without a dead human being to go with it? It's never happened before. Time will unzip.
I climbed in and began reaching around in near total darkness looking for keys. The trash-filled car stank horribly, and I found myself fighting exhaustion, nausea, and darkness to stay focused. By the time I realized the keys were already in the ignition, the creature was right outside the broken window, and I turned the car on and tried to dive down to reach the gas pedal with my hand, but I didn't get there. Part of the piles of trash turned out to be a man reclining in the driver's seat, and part of the smell turned out to be coming from his bloated body. Not my ghost. This man had died in his dark red sedan some time ago. Not my ghost. It grasped my pant leg through the window, and I felt my jeans disintegrate up to my knee, scrambling forward over his strangely moist, putrefying bag of flesh. I pushed the opposite door open and rolled out onto the sidewalk. The unbound ghost crawled through the car after me, but vanished with an elated, fading scream as it fell into temporal contact with its proper host. It hadn't cared. It just wanted a host. Any host. It had lied. With time properly bounced once more, and the universe zipped together correctly, the sun rose not too long after. I was not going to die, at least not today. But I changed my route and checked into a hotel to avoid falling asleep on the drive. I had to wonder. That particular ghost had lied. Was mine still out there waiting for me? That had been a very specific story the entity had told. What if that really had been my intended fate? What if I would have died if not for the accidental intervention of someone else's ghost? It's a strange feeling, but tonight, the stars again feel oddly close. I suffer from a condition called
Yeah, so I'm just looking for another story. But in the meantime, if anyone's there, could you give me any suggestions on what to put on? Just anything at all, anything that comes to mind. Anything to escape silence. Damn, this silence is killing me.
Who is he? My son inquired, pointing to the tall figure drawn upon the dusty, nearly crumbling page. As a reproduction of a reproduction of a reproduction, the history book could have easily been mistaken for the mad scribblings of troglodytes in their firelit caves. A great leader, I replied. If you remember his name anymore. Washington, I believe it was. Though it's quite likely I've been told many a falsehood by the ones who called themselves historians. I chuckled ruefully, as did my son. Tell me what a leader is, he said. Where I came from, it was not unusual for children to be demandingly curious. Well, from what I've heard, leaders were people who created order out of chaos, I told him. Many had great visions for what their world could be like, or, in Washington's case, what his country could be like. No doubt he's rolling in his grave now that everything he's worked hard to instate has fallen to ruin. By now, my son had put the old book aside and was peering out of the red-tinted window wistfully, his chin resting on his arms, which were in turn resting on the steel windowsill. And he said to me in a serious tone, I want to be a leader. It broke my heart to hear he had developed an unattainable dream, a dream I would have to shoot down before long. Such was the treatment all dreams were met with in those times. But the sadness I felt then seems silly to me now that I wonder in vain what has become of his poor soul. He could be anywhere, or nowhere, and it's likely I'll never know. By all that is holy, I only hope he is in a better place than I am now. According to the historians, there was a clear-cut and seemingly unbreakable force called natural law governing my native planet in ancient times. A set of rules you could follow carefully in order to predict the behavior of things and get to where you wanted to be. Of course, there was nothing of that sort to stabilize the era I grew up in. Life was a sick game of chance for us all, A game I wouldn't hesitate to call hellish if not for the fact that I'm now intimately familiar with the word's true meaning. I decided long ago that the only way to end the game would be to rid the cosmos of the Earth entirely, just as one might excise a malignant growth from an otherwise healthy individual. If there was no hope for us on the little white planet, we might as well bring some balance to the universe and cease to exist, I figured. The idea came to me in a most peculiar manner, worming its way into my consciousness as though it were the fey whisper of a shadowy muse. I hadn't the foggiest clue of how said idea could be carried out, but I searched for one whenever opportune nights presented themselves, whenever the sun ceased to scatter its radiation, never knowing what I might find, if anything. Each night lasted only as long as the Earth's prodigious rotational velocity would allow. I removed my son's evening rations from the icebox and served it to him on a sheet of cardboard, not telling him where the meat came from so that he wouldn't be deterred from getting his nourishment. Unbeknownst to him, wild game of the sort found in olden tales had long since gone extinct, leaving only the frozen, emaciated corpses of our own kind to dine on when they turned up now and again. Much of my own childhood was spent consuming the wholesome reserves of beans and rice stockpiled in the bowels of our bunker, but upon parenthood, it became clear to me that my child would not be so fortunate. I'd be lying if I didn't regret bringing him into that broken world many a time. Sustenance was growing scarcer by the day, so I forewent my share that eve. Not that raw human heart sounded very appetizing even in my desperate state. I would have roasted my son's rations for him if physics were cooperating that day. But alas, every attempt at striking a match, let alone igniting a bundle of tinder with one, resulted in a conflagration that lasted but a few milliseconds, expanding outward like a fireball and singeing the hairs on my hand before disappearing entirely. The elements, especially fire, seemed to take on different properties at different times, betraying nary a clear pattern in their fluctuations. This randomness decided the fates of men, and I feared it would soon decide my son's and my own for the worse, before I got a chance to do what I was meant to do. The sun began to race out of sight, heralding a new interval of darkness. It was time. "I'll be back," I said to my son as I donned my gloves and boots and leather coat, pulled the fur-lined hood over my head, gathered a few miscellaneous implements, and equipped an old but still functional gas mask. I couldn't say when I would be back due to the unpredictable time currents. Whether I would be back at all was no sure thing either, but some things are better lied about where children are concerned. My son didn't ask where I was going, for he knew better than to believe I'd made up my mind. Plans changed with the weather. Speaking of weather, I've always found it rather amusing that the term is said to have once encompassed so few variables. The temperature, the sun, the clouds, the wind, and a few other trifling things. Why, if the historian's words ring true at all, the ancients were a soft lot with no valid cause for worry. I faced the untraceable whims of a mad god and called them weather, while the history books detail parables about the melancholy nature of rain, which I hear was a phenomenon where tiny droplets of pure crystalline water fell out of the sky. Sounds like a utopian dream to me. Not melancholy in the least. On any occasion, I would have given anything to have rain problems instead of time problems and physics problems, not to mention problems of other planes of reality, which I now face head-on. Problems I could not label or name for the life of me, or shall I say for the death of me, as death has since usurped survival as my chiefest goal. There are dark, dark things lurking in the blackness betwixt the celestial bodies, and I have seen them, experienced them, lost myself to them. Give me all of your rainy days, O ancient ones, and I'll give you all of my demon-haunted nights. When I put my hand on the steel door handle and pressed down firmly, the pressure in the room changed, and a fierce wind howled through the newly opened gap, Before much of the enervating fumes from the outside filled the room, I was on the other side, and the door was sealed shut again. The windows of our Spartan, vault-like shelter were heavily tinted for a reason, to filter out the sun's torrid rays. As a side effect, the tinting prevented us from seeing the landscape as it truly was without wandering out of doors. Now that I was seeing it through my own eyes once again, and not through that blood-red filter, without which we would be solely irradiated to total disfigurement in the daylight minutes, I was simultaneously filled with awe and trepidation. There were massive, windswept dunes of snow heaped upon the horizon. Tall black towers protruded from many, blotting out dense clusters of stars with their staggering height. And then there was what was colloquially known as the brooding star, a great violet light burning in the sky. The inclination to admire its ominous beauty was familiar to me, as was the converse instinct to avert my gaze to avoid being lured by some insidious trap. To me, it was now second nature to second-guess everything. In the past, I had caught wind of too many Horde legends to be anything but cautious. But now I know from experience where those legends came from. Now I know that I wasn't nearly cautious enough. As always, I surveyed the land in search of a new opportunity to change things some way, somehow. It was not unusual for the various structures around me to shift positions overnight, or for new objects to come and go with the temporal tide. I noticed something conspicuous in the far, far distance, but before I wasted any time analyzing it, I withdrew my pocket watch and wound the timer so that it would alert me in 35 minutes, just a minute short of a full night's length. Then, I raised the brass spyglass I'd scavenged in my youth and strove to make out the dark, pointy thing resting in a valley between two knolls of snow. It was a pavilion, I realized. I'd seen many of them before, as the historians would often appear in congregations of white tents, ever riding the river of time to hawk their wares, which were debatable curiosities at best, risible forgeries at worst. But this pavilion was black and solitary. The optimist in me was excited, for I was witnessing something of untold promise, while the pessimist in me knew how dangerously far away the tent was, and made my muscles stiffen, as if to prevent me from trudging after it. No amount of protection would save me from the radioactive light of day if I failed to return home in time. The sun, however hot its golden beams may have been, were never enough to thaw the planet, but make no mistake, they never failed to pierce leather and flesh and bone and bestow ungodly maladies upon anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. I have seen the results of such poisoning, and they were not pretty. Unless you're psychotic enough to find prettiness in the gradual necrosis of skin, disintegration of cartilage, and rotting of gray matter. Staring pensively at the point of interest, I made what I now know to be the worst decision of my life. I began to march thither. By this time, the cold was already biting viciously at me, and soon a colossal gust threatened to topple me over, leading me to anchor myself in place by crouching for a time. The filter of my mask did a fair enough job at keeping me alive, but the air still smelled faintly of ammonia and a number of other inhospitable chemicals. A headache ensued. The time currents, for one thing, were calm that night, as I discovered when I peeked at my pocket watch and noticed the hands shaking only slightly. I could have used the currents to my advantage had I known the secrets of their workings, but only the historians and their masters knew those. It was rumored that the Black Towers had something to do with it all, and that the historians' masters were in fact the very extraterrestrials responsible for the existence of the towers. But who could have known for sure but the historians and the Star-Dwellers themselves? Inquisitive thoughts like these filled the time that elapsed between my outset from home and my arrival at the mysterious pavilion. The tent's canvas walls flapped in the wind as I approached it. Something about it filled me with dread now that I was able to observe it up close. Unnerved for reasons unknown, I would have turned around and fled right then and there, but curiosity and hope still burned in me. Against my better judgment, I walked stealthily toward the entrance flap, swept it aside slowly, and beheld the uncanny presence within. Sitting on the rusty metal grid of a mattressless cot was a robed, hooded figure with his head in his hands. A figure I surmised to be male, The robe, being many sizes too large for the being, covered everything but his pallid hands. He didn't appear to be wearing a gas mask, and thus I was puzzled as to how he managed to breathe the toxic atmosphere freely. More interesting than the weird being himself was the looking glass, large and triangular, situated on an easel of sorts behind him. I was mesmerized by it, for it didn't merely reflect what was before it, but was a veritable window into the amorphous depths of space. I saw on its surface a starlit nebula of many colors, all the while confused about how I could be seeing such a thing so clearly through what appeared otherwise to be a simple silver-framed mirror. A few wrought iron candelabra were arrayed along the pavilion's margins, and atop their candles danced otherworldly flames that I fancied were the color of lightning. In another world, I perhaps would have called them beautiful, but in that moment, they were, to me, horribly redolent of the brooding star. They evoked all the undesirable feelings of helplessness and nausea I would associate with the violet light in the sky, only on a smaller scale. It was in their sickly glow that I noticed a noose curled up beneath the cot. The figure's shallow breathing was his only movement. At this point, I began to lose my nerve, what with the uncomfortable silence and the eldritch appearance of all that I was beholding. I checked my pocket watch once more. 20 minutes remained. 15 were required just to make it back home, leaving me with hardly 5 minutes to spare. What could I hope to accomplish in 5 minutes? I wondered. When no answers came to mind, I released the entrance flap and turned my back on the pavilion.
I'm just gonna say this. Okay, so that's one bit, and then all of this just for the shoulder. That's just the shoulder piece. Oh my god, bro, this is the level of some master grade. Actually, not master grade. I'd say more like non-grade or just 1/100 scale high grade. But yeah, that's quite a bit for just a small kit, for just a high grade kit. You know what? Already so far, I'm gonna rank this kit a gold. As for how it actually holds up, we'll see how it holds up. Anyways, enjoy.
It was then that I heard a cold and hollow voice call out in a strange whisper from within the tent behind me.
Father.
I was stopped in my tracks.
Father.
He said again, his weary calls betraying both elation and despair as well as they could. I returned to the tent, this time sauntering all the way in and finding myself face to face with the odd being. His head was no longer buried in the spidery embrace of his pale fingers, though his face was still wholly obscured by hood and shadow. His breath was visible in the frigid air and leaked eerily from where his mouth ought to have been.
I've been waiting lifetimes for you, Father.
His voice was now incredibly quiet and difficult to interpret. I'm not your... I tried to interrupt, but he kept speaking.
You would think immortality would lead one to higher heights. But nay, it has only led me to this half-life. I have yearned for a feeling of joy such as that which your arrival has provided me. And joy I thought I could only experience in the presence of the brooding star itself.
A shiver crawled down my spine as he uttered those words, and a morbid curiosity proceeded to overtake me swiftly and inexplicably. A curiosity the likes of which I'd never experienced prior. This led me to ask, what do you know of the brooding star, and how could you possibly know anything about it? In the past, I had treated with skepticism the legends that the star was some kind of maleficent intelligence that probed the nightmares of hapless victims, apparently in search of something, like a demon seeking a corpse to possess. Yet, there was no denying that it was more than just a queer light with unnerving properties.
It speaks to me,
the being said.
For that privilege, I gave up the ability to speak to it, for it does not like to be challenged but by the ignorant. I gave up my humanity, my face, for this miserable existence, for the opportunity to... what was it? Bring order to chaos.
He let out a subhuman sigh.
So long have I carried out this dead life that my own desires have been nearly overshadowed by the androgynous dark, the chaotic light, the
As the being descended into a paroxysm of mad mumbling, shivering, and whimpering, I became repulsed by him, even though I now subconsciously thought of him as more than just a being. He was a messenger, a prophet, and an oracle, but surely not of holy influence or example. He was, at the time, the most unholy creature I ever saw, and yet there was also pity amid my repulsion. "I shouldn't be here," I said in a slight panic. "There is nothing for me here. I'm sorry. I just have to—"
You want to know its true name?
The oracle interjected.
I can sense your desire.
Before I could tell him otherwise, he profaned my ears and my soul with a distorted utterance that I dare say no mortal man would have been able to repeat. It was the ineffable appellation of the brooding star, the dread signature of an alien presence hopelessly beyond human comprehension. The noise awakened entirely new senses in me, inundating my consciousness with indescribably offensive extrasensory stimuli. A feeling I would compare to being roused from a deep sleep, having never experienced wakefulness before, by the most nightmarish banshee imaginable. That was when I knew I had stumbled upon something my species, or anything endemic to the third dimension, more accurately, was never meant to know. I had been exposed to an evil that confirmed one thing in my eyes. My little white planet had been wholly forsaken by God, left to the mercy of things even he would dare not confront. "Good day," I shouted deliriously, backpedaling toward the entrance so as to make my escape. The oracle screeched, lurching onto his feet. It was a screech much like that of a barn owl and slightly reminiscent of the wailing of a mountain lion, both of which I'd heard in allegedly antique recordings.
Our interests are mutual, Father. We both want to put an end to this chaos. I cannot do it without you. Don't you know?
"What do you want with me?" I managed to say. I could have bolted at that moment, but a strangling fear made me anxious about resisting.
I want you to summon the brooding star, that he may consume this corrupted world and restore the cosmic balance. You will be rewarded beyond your loftiest dreams for this deed, Father. Believe me.
It was my desire to see the earth destroyed, and now it appeared fate was on my side. This crazed oracle seemed to be the opportunity I had been seeking all along. "And what of my son?" I queried, forgetting momentarily that the oracle had illusions about his relationship to me. "What will become of him?" The oracle stared soundlessly in answer, and I felt his unseen eyes glaring at me from beneath his hood. Trying in vain to consider all the possible ways this scenario could unfold, I examined as many of the thoughts reeling inside my head as I could. Finally, I asked, "What must I do?"
Kill me.
He begged in a hoarse whisper.
Kill me.
That was enough. I couldn't deal with this deranged creature anymore. Fate be damned. I hastily backed into the starlit night and oriented myself in the direction of home, withdrawing my pocket watch without thought. To my shock, time had all but run out. 1 minute remained. I let out an unrestrained curse. Had that much time really passed? I might have completely lost touch with time while under the influence of the brooding star's foul name. I realized, or perhaps a temporal storm made its way past me without my knowing. Panic shot through me. If I was to end up dead, regardless of my next move, what choice did I have but to turn back and acquiesce to the oracle's mad request? With that, I drew my switchblade and steeled myself for what I thought was about to occur. But nothing could have prepared me for what actually did occur. My hot, stale breath made me dizzy as it collected in my poorly ventilated gas mask, yet it didn't prevent me from storming into the pavilion and taking a successful stab at the oracle's jugular. As he fell back onto the rusty cot, so too did his hood fall back. I instinctively looked away, for I beheld for a millisecond his grotesque, inhuman face. As I cowered, I noticed that my knife and sleeve were stained with blood that was as black as tar, not red as I would expect. I heard an airy cackle erupt from the oracle, no doubt the product of a newly damaged voice box and a long demented mind. Having made an oath to myself to put an end to this thing's pathetic life, I closed my eyes and stabbed savagely at the oracle's face and neck too many times to count. I felt the projectile spurting of unnaturally cold and viscous blood with every blow. Out of breath, I finally ceased my attack and opened my eyes with caution. His face was now obscured with his own inky bodily fluids, and thus slightly less frightening, but still more revolting than anything I'd ever seen before it. He lay there, gurgling with each breath, mere voiceless air bubbling out of his facial orifices, until he wheezed for the last time and went limp as a beheaded snake. The violet candles mysteriously extinguished themselves upon his death, darkening the already dark area, and the wondrous triangular looking glass ceased to be wondrous, appearing now to be nothing more than a conventional mirror spattered with a very much unconventional substance. A sudden gale beat violently against the canvas walls from outside. What have I done? I mumbled to myself. I made my way outside and looked around, noticing immediately that the brooding star was nowhere to be seen, seemingly extinguished or relocated. How its light managed to disappear so quickly was beyond me, for the theory of relativity, or a flawed interpretation of it at least, was not alien to me. Then again, if there was any place the ultimate speed limit of the universe might be broken, it would have been around that blasted plot of space-time whence I came. My pocket watch proceeded to ring stridently, heralding a wave of panic and presaging my doom. Death was now inevitable, though I had a seeming choice of how I would end. Radiation poisoning, chemical poisoning, blood loss, or perhaps hypothermia. Before I could ponder my options deeply, the scorching sun peeked over the horizon. I raised my arm to shield my eyes from the harsh twilight, which put me on my knees, knowing deep down that its harmful rays were indeed harming me. But the terrible luminosity was short-lived, for something exponentially more vile soon eclipsed the fiery orb from below and stifled its light. The moment I lowered my arm, I regretted everything, every decision leading up to that moment, and every minute that I continued to live. Blinding in its horror, a great tentacled mass rose from the horizon, an indubitable destroyer of worlds, spreading like a cancer across the crimson sky. There was no sunrise to speak of anymore, but a hellrise, a welling up of unadulterated unnaturalness that could only have originated from the lowest, coldest, darkest spheres of existence. The writhing mass was a storm in its own right, as I look back upon those distorted and nauseating memories. I recall flashes of lightning occurring in the hollows of its colossal, tangled body, but above it all, it was an abomination. Everything about it an insult to the world I now loomed above. I dare say no being, god or otherwise, would be capable of forgiving such a heinous monstrosity for its crime of mere existence. Nor would any god choose to protect his creation from its insane wrath at so late a stage. For surely anything it laid its multi-tenuous eyes and appendages upon would be instantly and forever tainted. A deep, foul moaning soon filled the air, evoking thoughts of a million tormented souls wailing desperately. This sent me to the ground, where I shook uncontrollably in a fetal position. The experience made me welcome death, and thus I removed my mask and allowed the noxious air to fill my lungs. My eyes, although shut at this point, detected darkness enveloping me on all sides. And such was the end of my corporeal existence, and the beginning of something far more odious than I could have ever imagined. My soul, for lack of a better word, lived through the catalyst, while I suspect my body's fate was to be digested in the cavernous depths of the brooding star. I found it difficult to ponder how this could be, how I could be conscious without resorting to the most horrible mental images, those depicting my brain's tissue interwoven with the star's charred and cancerous tendrils, its signal flowing through my exposed nervous system and thus subjecting me to its mysterious will, as well as providing me with sensory input forming a contrived and illusory reality. The clarity with which this idea presented itself to me was disturbing, to say the least. I would fain say the star spoke to me, but I think it would be more accurate to say I suddenly knew things that were previously unknown to me. A multiplicity of strange and obscure facts, some too hideous to dwell on. I knew now that the brooding star was never a star, but only appeared to be one by virtue of how it reflected the sun's light, an illusion much like that which the planetary bodies played on me as a child. Its true form was always that chaotic jumble of malignant limbs, curling and coiling wickedly in the vacuum of space as though it were a virus.
Okay, that is one of the scariest ones I've heard so far. I won't lie, but I don't think it's worth putting so many stickers on this because this requires so many color corrections. I mean, is it worth it? Kinda. It does look good, but at the same time, just no. That's too much to put on. But and a lot of them are folding as well. If there's one thing I hate about Double O, it's folding stickers. But hey, at least it works. As for whether this is the right way, I guess I don't know. Like, look, it's not folding in fully, so I think maybe I've done it wrong. If I've done it wrong, then please, by all means, let me know because I feel like this should be pushed further in.
In a vast protoplasm, changing shape so as to efficiently absorb energy from the stars. I also knew that the oracle I murdered was of great significance in the eyes of the star. Significance of the sort you might expect a god to regard his chosen prophet with. This fact made me afraid to open my eyes, knowing that I may have assassinated the right hand to the Apodic throne, and angered the tenebrous monarch itself. Indeed, there appeared to be a monarch of sorts holding this accursed dimension together. The living celestial body at the head of this monarchy, the writhing scourge whose colloquial name has never been more than a feeble concession to the inadequacy of language, was so much older and greater than mankind as to gaze down upon us with indifference and cruelty, like a child upon ants. Perhaps we have always been depraved monsters to the ants, while we thought ourselves righteous and just. Such were my musings in the darkness. I can't tell you how long it took me to finally open my eyes, but I can recall quite clearly the happening that melted my fear away. A raindrop struck my forehead. My eyes shot open. By the heavens, the oracle spoke the truth. I marveled, utterly dumbfounded. I believed at that moment that I had been rewarded beyond my loftiest dreams, for I lay in a grassy field under a partly cloudy azure sky that cried tears of joy. It was an idyll that exceeded my personal definition of paradise. None of the ungodly things circulating in my head mattered anymore. I made excuses to shoo them away, calling them mere meaningless aberrations, and giving credence to the radical possibility that the brooding star was not wholly malign. As I stood up, I saw a green hill before me, on top of which was quite possibly the most beautiful tree ever conceived of, its green leaves ever greener than the rich vegetation around them. I threw myself boldly up the hill for such love of what I was seeing, what splendid, fantastical verdure. I had heard stories of the color green, a color too fresh and genial for the corrupted land I hailed from, but to see it with my own eyes, I could not put the feelings into words if the eternal fate of my soul depended on it. From atop the hill, I could see a small hamlet of 7 or 8 slate-roofed buildings, as well as a rickety windmill watching over it like a silent guardian. I leaned on the tree at the center of this hill and looked up. Apples. So many apples, bright red and seductively appetizing. I reached out with a trembling hand and almost reverential care, plucked one from the nearest tree, and took a goodly bite from its crisp flesh. Regret followed. The fruit was shockingly and unbearably bitter. Nay, it was something else entirely. Something worse. Something that seemed to trigger every safety reflex in my body. Having spit out the foreign substance and dropped the apple to the ground, I saw that it was black and tainted inside. This sight, and the spell of the dry heaves and violent gagging that overtook me immediately, led me to conclude that the fruit was evil in the absolute. Of how long it took me to recover exactly, I am not aware, but it must have been at least an hour. What does the fruit of this land say of the land of itself? The ground that feeds this damnable tree, I thought, as I lay there with my back against the grass. My mind began to return to places I never thought it would visit again. The sky darkened in proportion to the darkening of my thoughts, thus losing its heavenly blueness. I realized that although the sky behaved as it would if the sun were setting, there was no sun in sight, and no longer a single cloud behind which it could be hiding. My despondent mind then filled with thoughts of my son. What fate could have befallen him, I wonder, prior to the end of my physical life? I doubted that there could have been worse fate than living on Earth, a world I assume was completely destroyed. It was my choice to destroy the world, and while I consider it a terrible mistake for my part, I cannot speak for my son. I know nothing of how he feels, or if he even feels at all, and likely never will know. It soon occurred to me that there was hope, however meager, in the little hamlet I saw from the hilltop. This hope was enough to bring me shakily to my feet and direct my eyes toward the buildings in the distance. I noticed a certain unearthliness in the settlement that I failed to notice before. Notably, the windmill rotated with an eerie slowness that elicited vertiginous sensations if I stared at it too long. I headed thither out of desperation, and the closer I came to said windmill, the more keenly aware I was of the unpleasant crookedness of it, the stilts that made up its frame reminding me of an amalgamation of wooden skeletons clinging to each other. When I found myself past the corroded iron gate and amid the hamlet's constituent buildings, I swept the area with my eyes in search of life or anything else of interest, a practice I perfected during my many earthbound nights of yesterlife. From what I could see, there was nothing but blackness behind the windows, and blackness at the bottom of the well, which marked the center of the settlement. It was seemingly a ghost town, a place I knew deep down was incapable of fulfilling any hopes of mine. Nevertheless, I resolved to check each building about me for, well, such has been the theme of my existence. I've never known exactly what to look for, or if there was ever anything worth seeking to begin with. The first house I entered all but begged me to leave. I was half choked by the wall of musty air that greeted me, which was undoubtedly a byproduct of the black spots I saw eating away at the mildewy rugs and wood plank walls. Had not the twilight illuminated much of the place through the single window in the parlor, I'm sure I would have been in pitch darkness, for that is what I found in the peripheral rooms and closets. Darkness so thick I should have suffocated in it. Nothing useful was found. The next handful of buildings I checked, which included an abandoned apothecary shop and a cobweb-infested shed, among other, more unclassified structures, were hardly more welcoming. I fancied I described the vague outline of a multi-armed, barely human body decaying neath a sinister pile of dust, but I decided it could have been an illusion, for my imagination grew stranger as the shadows grew longer. The last dwelling I scoured was the largest in the settlement, full of rooms I could not discern the purpose of, as well as a few that were indubitably used for torturous purposes, judging by the dried bloodstains and spiked draconian contraptions. It was with great unease that I found a child's bedroom in that same house. Scattered across the floor were children's toys that, upon close inspection, were revealed to be abused beyond recognition by their owners. Wooden horses were dismembered, porcelain dolls divested of their eyes, all seemingly in sacrifice to a special doll who sat in a dark corner with supernumerary limbs attached to its body and black eyeballs peering out of the many artificial holes in its face. I knew at once that this doll was a vulgar effigy of the brooding star. Not at all accurate, but indicative of a desperate attempt on the part of its maker to please the star and be freed from its influence. This was inexplicably clear to me, just as a number of other unearthly things were when I awoke to this realm. Around the effigy's neck was a thin chain, and dangling from that chain was a skeleton key. It wasn't until I approached the dark corner cautiously and tore the key from its chain that I realized how repulsive a key could be. Its wickedly gnarled loops and twists seemed impossibly irreverent to the laws of geometry, causing a haunting paranoia to addle my brain, made worse by the countless eyes of that unnatural effigy staring psychotically at me from the darkness. Though everything about the key was unpleasant, I felt as though I would regret leaving it behind. So I slipped it into my pocket in hope that I needn't catch a glimpse of it ever again. As I turned around and headed for the door, my stride was quickened by a peculiar scuttling noise of unknown provenance. I was feeling vulnerable and claustrophobic from the tenebrous atmosphere already, but that shuddersome sound sent me over the edge. I had to get out of there. And get out of there I did. Returning to the open air was not as comforting as you would expect, for there was an uncomfortable absence of fresh air. Specifically, there seemed to be no air at all, only a profound emptiness that refused to console me. By now,
What the
night had fallen entirely, along with my spirits. I couldn't decide which fate would be worse, being all alone in this unwelcoming world, or sharing it with the unwholesome beings of the scuttling, many-limbed sort my imagination hinted at. Another dichotomy of fates presented itself to me. Madness or sanity, which would be more preferable? To be at the mercy of real horrors and keep my head, or face illusionary ones and lose it? Unfortunately, I would have no say in the matter, and thus the pondering proved pointless. Wandering aimlessly across the center square of the hamlet, I was bedeviled by fate, indecipherable voices. I was on the verge of mistaking them for the wind, that is, until I remembered that there was no wind. I put my ear to the ground many times in many places, hoping to locate the source of these voices, to no avail. Eventually, I noticed the voices grew more hasty and demonic each time I walked past the central well, and so I approached it. It was obvious to me that this well was the source of the whispers. I put my hands on its somewhat slimy stone rim and peered down it as I did when I first passed through the gates of the ghost town, this time with more intention. I once again saw only blackness, and I smelled metallic vapors reminiscent of blood wafting up from the depths. That was when I heard it. The well whispered. Could it be? I wondered. Could it be my son, trapped in the depths of this wretched place? Or could it be the delusional oracle who ought to be dead? How is this happening? How is this happening? Son! I shouted into the well. There was no comprehensible response, only disembodied whispers growing more impatient. The deathly vapors began to affect me in strange ways, making me feel dizzy and listless. A sudden weakness overtook me and forced me to use the well's rim for support. To my panic, this weakness grew worse until, after a minute or so, I was all but paralyzed and entirely deprived of balance, leaving me at the mercy of gravity, who was not merciful, and saw to it that I slid helplessly into the well's gaping maw. There was a splash and a number of crunching sensations as I collided with the floor. Indeed, it felt as though I had broken every bone in my body. I opened my eyes to the pool of water I lay prostrate in, which was quite shallow, yet dark as the river Styx was said to be. I lifted my head up, despite the pain of doing so, and made a feeble attempt at surveying my surroundings. The optical sense aside, I already knew I was in some kind of dank chamber by the reverberation and humidity alone. It was with sight that I discerned the rest of the nature of said chamber, and its nature was loathsome beyond words. Cages environed me like the cells of a panopticon, to which I was the central eye. Creatures of indescribable repugnance convulsed impatiently in these cages, teeth gnashing, limbs shaking, their rotted larynxes giving vent to insane desires now that they sensed vulnerable prey in their midst. The abhorrent, torturing wails, I knew, would never end until I released these blasphemous horrors from their squalid enclosures to do with me what they would. I recognized at once the holes in the cage's locks, and my hand all but drew itself to the twisted key in my pocket, that I might subject myself willingly to the lesser of two ghastly evils. This reality bears all the hallmarks of a great and terrible thought occurring in a great and terrible machine, the biological machine that is the brooding star. But what is the reality I previously inhabited? Was it merely another thought in another machine? No matter. Philosophy will not save me, for I have been hexed with upwards of 1,000 curses, one of them increasing the potency of my memory 100-fold. I would have considered that a boon in my previous life, but here and now it causes me great agony. Every 7 years I am forced by these things, my savage masters, to relive the horrors of my past, to novelize my trauma, that their pursuits of torture and torment may be immortalized and regarded with favor by the brooding star. All of my trials, the tainted apple, the harrowing effigy, the noxious well, and the others I have written of elsewhere, all of it was by design, formulated by the underlings of a veritable interstellar god. I reside on my knees in a room furnished with a stone altar upon which stacks of gray, sickly vellum, a vitreous inkwell, and a raven quill rest. There are innumerable shelves surrounding me on all sides, shelves upon which the works of my misfortunes lie by the score. My painful memories become more lucid with every pen stroke, made worse by the inevitable fact that my future will be just as dreadful or worse than the days before me. Dread specters patrol the halls tirelessly. Even now, there must be one leering at me from the shadows. I know it. The curses prevent me from falling into a comfortable insanity as the beings about me have, leaving me gazing longingly over the edge of dementia. Every second of every moment, silently begging for oblivion. Give me all of your rainy days, O ancient ones, and I'll give you all of my demon-haunted nights.
So for those of you wondering, I was having a bit of issues with getting that bit into there. Then I realised still had this clear piece. Can't fit both in. Either way, that gets covered up, so not really no point holding on to it. Actually, let's see if can I down here we'll start about.
Down here.
Oh shit.
Those were the words my friend whispered to me that night, and though a year has passed, they still fester in my mind, shapeless and meandering like a blinded fog. When I entered his house, the lights at the front were off. Outside, the weather was still, the air thick and muggy, as if waiting for a breath. It seemed as though the summer had been building toward that evening. Stifled, sweat-drenched, sleepless nights one after the other, and we just needed a little rain to clear the air. Forecasters warned us that we were in for a lot worse than that, but they had been wrong so often that many in our little suburb did not listen. I was one of them. I had received a phone call from Alia an hour earlier. It had been a while since we last spoke. A couple of years, in fact. When I answered the call, there was a momentary silence before she spoke. Her words trembled with nervousness. I put this down to anxiety. She probably thought I would yell at her, considering everything that had happened before, but now I know there was much more to it than that. After a brief exchange of reluctant pleasantries, we finally got down to the root of the phone call. "Eric needs you." Those were the last words I expected her to say. 2 years previous, I had cut both of them out of my life. Alia and I had been in a relationship, albeit in its early stages, but I cared for her deeply. Eric was a close friend. I need not tell you of what went on between them. It was too painful then. It still is now. Why would Eric need me? I asked, feeling the old resentment and festering betrayal still burning a poisoned hole somewhere in the back of my mind. A slight crackle of interference hummed over the line. He was sick. We broke up a few weeks ago. He won't get help. I've tried to get through to him, his parents too, but he won't listen to any of us. And you think he'll listen to me? What makes you think I'd want to help him anyway? Please, David. put everything aside for a minute. If you can't do it for Eric, do it for his parents. Alia was right. Eric's parents had been good to me when I was growing up. My own parents were pretty cold, but Eric's had always welcomed me into their home with open arms like a surrogate son. At first, I wasn't sure what help I could be, but from what Alia told me, David had been suffering from delusions and refused to seek medical help. It shouldn't have come as a surprise to me. Eric had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia several years previous. It had been a tough time for everyone who knew him. After spending nearly a year in a psychiatric ward, he was released back into the community. Everyone rallied around him, and in time, with medication, therapy, and support, his symptoms became manageable. As long as he stayed away from booze and drugs, it looked like he'd be able to live a normal life. Things had obviously changed since then. Alia sounded desperate, and when she finally told me that she had split up with Eric a few weeks earlier, that softened the blow to a degree. If Eric didn't have her, then at least he could not hold her over me. I'm ashamed to admit it, but where love is involved, pettiness seeps through the marrow. It gets into your bones. As it turned out, Alia had tried to phone Eric earlier that night and check in on him, although they were no longer an item. She still wanted to make sure that he was okay while his family was out of town. She'd promised Eric's parents that she would check on him a couple of times while they were away on an important business trip. When she knocked on his front door, Eric refused to let her in, his voice sounding manic and confused. "I'm afraid he's going to kill himself," Alia said, the pain in her voice evident. The fact that she still cared for him so much stuck in my throat like a jagged lump of ice. And yet, I was unable to resist the pain in her voice. She was asking me for help, and there was a satisfaction in that. Not something I'm proud of, but there nonetheless. Bolstered by this, and giving into what little affection I still had for Eric, most of it from memories of us playing together as children, I did as Alia asked, and headed over to his parents' house. The big storm weather forecasters had predicted still had not hit. We were warned that when it did, we were likely to see 100-mile-per-hour winds, which would bring with it damaged roofs, falling trees, and power cuts. Driving for 10 minutes to Eric's house, I looked at the sky, which was a deep purple red, with night about to fall. Above, the clouds moved swiftly like sea foam on a torrent, while down at ground level, things were deadly quiet. Pulling up outside Eric's family home, I got out of my car and was immediately struck by the smell of ozone in the air. I'd always loved that smell, and the charged feeling only present before a storm, but in the back of my mind I knew I could not hang around for too long. Hopefully, I would get back to my own place before the storm hit. When I reached Eric's front door, I expected to knock, but as I raised my hand, the door opened slowly. There, standing in the light of his hall, was my old friend. His black hair was longer than I remembered, reaching down to his jawline, which was covered with stubble, and his eyes were red as if they'd been up all night or crying. Probably both. His unshaven face stared at me in disbelief for a moment, and before I could so much as muster a hello, Eric reached out and wrapped both arms around me. He held me close and let out a short whimper as if overcome with emotion. The smell of tobacco and sweat from him was strong and sickening, and immediately those smells conjured up an image of Eric, awake for several nights, smoking, pacing, trying to figure out some horrid delusion. "It's good to see you, David," he said, letting me go and ushering me inside. "I've missed you." Deep down inside, I still sheltered resentment towards him for stealing Alia from me, but seeing him in such a state of distress, I felt the older feelings of care and friendship returning to me, like blood flowing to a limb long gone to sleep. A tingle, and then a surge of emotion. I'd forgotten just how much I had missed Eric, too. His parents' home was a good size, a 4-bedroom townhouse. Eric's mother had made a tidy sum as a real estate agent, and so the street they lived on was one of the more affluent in the area. Since Eric's breakdown, he'd been living with his family, but they were away on a business trip for a few days. I suppose they needed to get on with their lives as much as anyone, and that had left Eric to delve deeper into his delusions. I followed him down the hallway As I did so, I noticed that the cellar door was open slightly. A solitary light bulb glowed at the foot of the flight of the stairs, burrowing under the house. As I peered down there, Eric turned to me and reacted quickly to my curiosity. He reached across and pushed the cellar door shut. As he did so, a draft caught the light bulb dangling below. It moved slowly like a pendulum, catching wooden beams and boxes with its light, spreading shadows momentarily before the door clicked shut. "How have you been, Eric?" I asked, walking through the doorway into the living room, slumping into the armchair. He didn't answer me at first. He reached up with his hand and rubbed his forehead, pushing his long hair against his eyes as if in pain. Alia phoned me. That was enough to get his attention. He looked up at me as I sat across from him in a wicker chair, which I knew was once his grandmother's. We stared at each other across the tiny space between us. Outside, the clouds swirled and closed in, visible through a large window which looked down on a sloping hill. "You know we broke up then." Eric didn't take his eyes off me for 1 second, as if he was searching for a tell. Perhaps he was frightened that I was now entangled with her. "Yeah, I know," I answered, looking him straight in the eye. He scratched the stubble on his cheek. "Are you two a thing now?" I laughed. It was a ridiculous question. After everything she and Eric put me through. "No, we're not, and we won't ever be. I'm here because I don't want your parents to come back from their trip to find you swinging from a rope." There was a silence between us. Eric looked at me through thin strands of hair. "Alia thinks you're suicidal. Are you?" I took off my jacket, placing it next to me. The hesitation told all. "Christ, Eric! What are you thinking?" I was getting agitated. I had hoped that I would come to see him and find that Alia's claims were exaggerated, but his sullen expression, the fact that he had not washed for days, and the look in his eyes, there was every chance I'd have to phone an ambulance and let a psychiatric ward deal with him. "You don't understand, David. You can't." "Try me." I moved to the edge of my seat, clasping my hands. "Eric, I'm here to help you. Believe me. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to be." Sighing, Eric rubbed his eyes, as if to rid himself of tears or tiredness. Perhaps both. "Just promise me you'll stay away from Alia. I don't think I could cope." "And I could?" "You don't understand, David. I'm on the edge here. One push and I'm finished." "I've no interest in her. She left me for you, Eric. You're best done with her. We both are. Now you're going to tell me what's happening or what? Have you been taking your medication?" A look fluttered across Eric's face. Guilt, shame, helplessness. Take your pick. "There's your answer, then." I was relieved that there was a solution. "Where are they? You need to start taking them to help balance you out. You know that." "It's not the medication, David." He now glazed across at me intently. "It's... You won't believe me." Something then tapped against the window. Eric recoiled back in his chair, his eyes wide with fear. "What's that?" It was almost dark, and something outside was attracted to a lamp which sat next to the window. "It's just a moth or something." "Is it?" Eric asked. "Well, yes," I assured him, as the indistinct shape now moved off. "What else would it be?" "Oh, God!" Eric started whimpering, bringing his hands up to his mouth. He stared at the rich red carpet at his feet and shuddered, as if a great anxiety were trying to escape from inside. Seeing Eric like that, I could not help but feel pity for him. The illness had robbed him of his mind in the past, and now it was threatening to do the same again. "Eric, please, just tell me what's upsetting you. Maybe I can help." At first, he seemed unresponsive, but after fetching him a glass of water, he finally gave in to my requests. His only stipulation was that I had to be open-minded about what he had to tell me. Sitting forward on the edge of his chair, the night now in full effect as the wind began to howl outside, Eric told me his tale. "Everything was fine up until a few weeks ago. Things seemed great with Alia. My parents were really pleased because we were talking about getting a place together. I think Mom and Dad feel it's time I try to get back out on my own 2 feet. With Alia, Anything seemed possible. I'm sorry, David. I know it's not fair to go on about her to you. I just mean that I've been stable for a good while now, and I was really ready to move on with my life. Every day I go for a long walk. It gets the endorphins going, helps my mood. The doctors say exercise is critical for mental health. I've really felt that. It's made a big difference. I go for a walk and listen to a podcast, Joe Rogan, or Duncan Trussell. That walk is something I look forward to each and every day, but on that day, about 3 weeks ago, it was different. I had just finished listening to something on my phone when I came to my usual spot, just next to Kings Park train station. Now, normally I walk back up past the primary school and up towards home, but something caught my attention. I know it sounds weird, but I thought I could see smoke coming from the railway bridge. From the street on top, at least. I mean, you ever looked at a road on a hot day and you see the haze coming off of it? Well, it was like that, but there was a kind of black fuzziness to it. Like some of it was transparent and the rest not. I thought something was burning, so I walked across Kings Park Avenue and ended up standing at the edge of the bridge. When I got closer, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was no traffic around at that time, but I swear to you, David, I saw this black haze in the middle of the road. There was no fire. It was just sitting there on top of the road surface, about 3 feet high. Looking around, I was alone with it on the bridge. I started to walk towards it, and as I did, things got stranger. I could hear my footsteps, but they sounded sort of muddied, deeper, and stifled somehow. No echo or nothing, like I'd walked into a small room. I looked up and the sun blinded me for a second. It was brighter than before, but I swear it was like I was looking at everything through water. You know how it bends light? Then the black haze, the smoke, whatever it was, it started moving off to the side. It mounted the pavement and then reached the wall above the train station. It started moving. I swear to God, David, it started moving like a person or an animal or something, like it had hands. It climbed over the wall and disappeared over the edge of the bridge. There was another silence. I guessed that Eric was waiting for me to react, but I didn't know what to say except, Eric, you're hallucinating again. That's all it was. You need to take your medication. Eric looked at me with pleading eyes. No, it wasn't a hallucination. I swear it was real. And this is what's been on your mind. Eric calmed for a moment and sank back into his chair. As soon as it disappeared under the bridge, everything went back to normal. I ran home in a panic. I thought it was a hallucination. But, David, I was still taking my medication then. That made things worse. If Eric's medication was wearing off or he was relapsing, there was no telling how bad he would get. I'd seen him at his worst years before. It took him and his family years to get over it. Eric, I said, not sure what I was going to say next. Let me finish. I need to get this off my chest. I wish I'd been able to leave what I saw at the back of my mind, but over the next couple of days, I started to obsess about what I'd seen. I'm not doing a very good job of putting it into words, but I kept thinking about the haze coming off the ground and the black smoke inside. I couldn't stop thinking about how it climbed over the wall like it had arms. You went back? I asked, knowing the answer before I'd even asked the question. Something tapped against the window again. Eric looked at the sheet of glass, his face drained of color. The outside world was now a deep, abyssal black. Orange streetlights from the city beyond the only reprieve. Sweat dripped from my friend's forehead, and his mouth began to tremble. Eric, look. Standing up, I walked over to his side and pulled the tall lampstand over the glass. There, a large moth bumped against the glass, feverishly trying to reach the light. See, it's just a moth. It's nothing to worry about. Can you be sure? Said Eric. slumping back into his chair, looking exhausted. Moving back to my chair, I sat down, ready to continue the conversation. What happened when you went back to the bridge? I couldn't help myself. I had to see if it had just been all in my head. And what did you see? Nothing. I saw nothing. Well, there you go, Eric. It was just a one-off incident. I'm sure once you take your... Eric cut me off. I saw nothing, but I heard something. The delusion had obviously taken full hold of my friend, and I worried that it was becoming more likely, as the storm closed in, that I would have to phone an ambulance or have him committed or sectioned. What did you hear? I said, hoping that by talking through it, I could persuade him out of his obsession. I got to the bridge. It was raining, but not too heavy. There was nothing out there, just a couple of parked cars and someone walking with an umbrella on the other side of the street. Part of me was delighted that I couldn't see anything, but another part, it wanted to know more about that strange thing on the road. When I reached the section of the wall where the thing had climbed over, I hesitated for a second. The wall was too high to peer straight over, but it was just above one of the arches where the train line runs through. I stood there for a moment, waiting. Just as I'd convinced myself that it was all in my head, I felt that strange, oppressive atmosphere, like the sounds of the world had been deadened. Then I heard a voice. It came from under the bridge. It said in a horrid whisper, "Down here." I was terrified. I can't convey how sinister it was, but I felt a strange compulsion to do as it said, or asked. I'm not sure if it was a command or a request. Down here. What did it mean? Was it telling me there was something under the bridge which I had to see, or was it whispering that phrase for some other purpose? I struggled against the urge to follow, knowing that to give in to a hallucination would be such a huge step backwards for me. I would jeopardize my state of mind, letting that illness back in. So I came home, but with each step towards my mom and dad's house, the thought that it wasn't a hallucination tugged at me, that I'd witnessed and heard something incredible. Those thoughts wouldn't leave me, and so the next day, I knew I'd have to return. I'd have to find out what it was without facing it, without putting myself in danger. I hoped that I would find nothing, and so then I could be sure that it was all in my head. Rain now joined the wind outside, tapping the glass furiously like 1,000 unseen fingertips. Well, it looks like the storm has arrived. My heart sank a little. I had hoped to avoid driving home in it, especially given the weather warnings. I knew I would have to leave soon, but I was gripped by Eric's account of his hallucination, and wanted to be sure that he would not do anything silly once I left. Just a little longer, I thought. Eric looked out at the water dripping down the outside glass. You should go, David, before it gets worse. It's okay, Eric. Please, at least tell me the rest of your story, and then we can chat about how to get you back on the right track. I went back to the bridge the following day, but this time, I took a camera with me, my DSLR. I wanted to see if I could capture an image of whatever that thing was, so I waited until around 2 p.m. The place is always quiet at that time. No school kids running around on their lunch break, no one else coming and going from their work. I got to the bridge, and he trailed off for a moment, turning his attention to the window, where the rain now lashed against the house outside. There was a look on his face, just a flicker, as though he saw something, before shaking his head slightly and whimpering a few words to himself. I never heard what it was, but it had all the hallmarks of someone reassuring themselves that all was well with the world, even though trouble clearly brewed. Composing himself, he continued. At first, I stood there where the thing had climbed over the wall, just waiting to see if anything was said, but all I heard was a train moving underground and stopping at the station before heading off to Glasgow Central. So I walked down the station stairs and took a couple of shots of the stone arches from halfway down. I'd never been afraid of that place before. We used to play around there as kids, you remember? I mean, Kings Park train station can be a little isolated, but apart from that, in fact, I'd always enjoyed getting the Newton train on my way home from town, but something was different about it. Looking at the stone arches, I could see where the train passed under the bridge, but I realized That was not where the haze would have hidden. On the embankment, directly beneath that part of the wall, was another half-arch which was covered by overgrown thorn bushes. There's no train line through there. You know what I'm talking about. We climbed down there a couple of times when we were kids. Remember? I laughed. That was something I had long forgotten about, but it was true. We had climbed down there once. I remember being edged on to run across the train tracks. When we had gotten to the half-arch, we found it filled mostly with soil, but there was a pretty big space inside. It was dark and spanned the width of the street above. Once inside, you could stand up. It felt like another world in some ways. When Eric and I had been kids, we built countless dens around Kings Park and found several places away from prying eyes. Those were secret places where we would visit, our crowd of friends feeling like a group of bandits in our hideouts. That thought was exciting, but we didn't frequent the half-arch under the bridge very often. It was too dark, too cold and damp. I think we were about 12 at that time. I remember we found some smudges in the soil, which our friend Stuart swore were footprints. I guess we only went back once or twice after that, and we found more markings in the ground. We decided we didn't want to run into the owner down there in the dark, away from the world. That, and the trains passed through the main archway, which we were about a foot of solid stone away from. The place vibrated like hell. The noise was deafening. I remember thinking I could feel my insides moving as the trains passed. It was not a pleasant sensation. Did you see anything in the half-arch? I asked. Not at first. Eric scratched at the stubble around his chin. I took 2 pictures and checked them on my DSLR. I could only snap the opening of the half-arch. It's further away on the other side of the train tracks. There was nothing unusual about the photos, so I turned to walk all the way onto the platform and see if I could get a better view. The train station was empty. Again, I took a few pictures on the edge of the platform, but all I got was the blackness of the opening under the bridge. The train neared, and I heard the high-pitched whine on the tracks before it reached me. When it stopped, a few people got off, not many. Then the train continued on its way far down the line towards Glasgow Central. When I turned to look at the archway once more, I was struck by what I saw. A form of some kind peeking out, glaring at me from the archway. A transparent haze with something black like smoke or mold at the center. Quickly, I raised the camera and took a picture as it moved back under the archway, and then it was gone. Let me guess, I said. When you looked at the picture, there was nothing there. A wry smile crept across Eric's face as the storm, wind, and rain and all was now in full effect outside. He stood up excitedly and rushed out of the room. Moments later, he returned, camera in hand. With a click, the camera powered on, and a dull glow emanated from the LCD screen, uplighting Eric's face like a macabre gargoyle as he smiled down at his work. "Here," Eric said. "Take a look for yourself." Handing me the camera, he sat back down in his chair, the excitement in his face now diminishing, replaced once more with worry. I looked down at the LCD screen. It was indeed a picture of the half-archway under the station bridge. At first glance, I could see nothing, but as I zoomed in, sure enough, there it was. The shape of some description cast in shadow. It was difficult to make out. In fact, it could have almost been anything. "This is your ghost?" "Ha!" Eric proclaimed. "A ghost? Who knows? Maybe that's exactly what it is. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's something we're not meant to see, and for some reason I was unlucky enough to cross paths with it on that day. Something which usually stays out of sight. Now it doesn't want me to go on telling people about it." "You're putting far too much weight on a blurry image, Eric. It could be dirt on the lens, or an insect moving quickly in front of the camera." "No!" Eric was getting angry. "Look at it!" He stood up and practically leaped over to me. "Look at the shadow cast across it! That's from the bridge! Whatever it is, it was there, and it's under the half-archway." The wind battered against the window, the glass reverberating, and with it a flash of lightning across the sky. Eric turned to it for a moment, then returned his gaze to mine, standing above me. "You should go. You don't believe me, and this storm is only going to get worse." "It's not that I don't believe you saw something, Eric, but look at it objectively. Either you saw something otherworldly that can't be explained, or you hallucinated, which has happened to you before when your medication needed tweaking. Which seems more likely? It's nothing to do with my schizophrenia. It has everything to do with the thing under the bridge. His voice trailed off for a moment, as if a distant threat made itself known in his mind. David, it spoke to me. It said, down here. It wants me to go somewhere. I can feel it. Have you been back to the bridge since you took the photo? He shook his head. No, but I've no need to. What do you mean? I asked, worried. I don't think I've ever been alone since the day I took its photo. Not truly. You mean you've seen it elsewhere? Not exactly. A look of frustration swept across his face. He started to pace up and down, wringing his hands as he spoke. It hides in the dark. I don't think it can last long in the light. I think the day I saw it in the sun and the haze around it, I think it might have been burning. Burning. Come on, Eric, snap out of it. Let me prove it to you, Eric. Come with me to the bridge tomorrow, once the storm has passed. If there's nothing there, I'll concede it's in my mind. And if there's something, then maybe we'll be the first to come face to face with. I don't know what exactly, but it could be monumental. When someone is caught in such a delusion, trying to persuade them out of it can be a thankless task. I had to change my strategy. Okay, Eric. Tomorrow we'll go to the bridge. On one condition. Name it. You start taking your medication. Right now. Eric reluctantly agreed to my terms, and I watched as he took his medication pill by pill. I knew how the drugs worked. It would take some time, perhaps even weeks, before they would start to affect his system and bring him back to Earth. But the earlier he took them, the sooner he'd be back to his usual self. After that, he assured me he would be okay. My promise of going to the bridge the next day seemed to have lessened his feverish behavior. He actually thanked me. Now he did not feel so alone. After that, he then walked me to the front door, and we said our goodbyes. Tomorrow we would see what we would see. I hoped that it would be reason. Outside, the complexion of the night had changed markedly. The storm was now rampant, and so I hurried out onto the street and to my car, pulling my jacket around me. The thunder roared overhead up in the black clouds, and the wind raged against it in return, nearly knocking me off of my feet as I reached the door of my car. Now the rain came, and as I sat in the driver's seat, even with my windscreen wipers on, I was staring through a sheet of water which warped the road and all of its shadows. What had been a simple drive earlier in the night was now going to be fraught with danger. Above, the lightning sparked, and soon after, the thun clapped like the gods waging war in the sky. I was taken back to being a child on a caravan holiday. I remembered the thunder sounding like it was just above where I slept, roaring so loud that I imagined my bones shaking. It was the first time I realized that man is powerless when faced with the will of nature. This is crazy, I said to myself, commenting both on the ferocity of the storm and my foolish attempt to travel home during it. But I felt that I had already done my bit, and did not want to spend more time with Eric than I had to. I wanted to help, but our friendship was far from mended, and the thought of spending the night in his company was something for which I was not ready. The car grumbled into life, and I waited for a moment to see if the rain would subside enough for me to see better. The windscreen wipers flashed back and forward over the glass in excited motion, barely providing a split second of good visibility through every movement. The lightning and thunder screeched once more. It felt closer that time, and as I looked around me, 2 trees further along the road were being shoved around, bending and leaning in the wind, so much so that they looked like they could give in at any moment. Another flash of lightning, this time cold, cutting across the sky like a bloodied scar, peeking through the dark clouds. Just as I concluded that the weather was not going to get any better, in fact, it looked like it was getting worse, I turned my attention to Eric's house again. The lights were off. The storm must have caused a power cut, as the other houses on the street were also now bathed in darkness, and the street lights were no longer working. He's an adult, I said to myself. He can take care of himself. And the thought of something he said earlier in the evening. It hides. It hides in the dark. I betrayed myself for even considering it. No. Whatever he saw that day under the bridge was a hallucination. But now, stuck in the dark, I had an image of Eric in my mind, besieged by his own illness, seeing and hearing things that were not there. Frustrated with myself that I could not just drive away, I opened the car door to the elements and headed back towards Eric's house. The street was in complete darkness, the only light source the increasing cracks of lightning, which drew hideous caricatures of the world around me in shadow. Taking out my mobile phone, I turned the flashlight function on and used the underpowered narrow beam to light my footsteps as best I could. A gust of wind blew towards me, and in it, I found it difficult to breathe. I walked at an angle against it, passing a tree which groaned under the weight of the wind, which itself swirled around everything, consuming it in an elemental roar. Quickly I moved down the garden path, and finally, I reached Eric's front door. I was expecting to have to knock, go in and make sure he was okay, perhaps even reluctantly spend the night until the power came back on. But when I reached the front door, it was lying open. The wind now carried the rain into the open doorway. All I could see was the blackness therein, and presented with it. I felt nervous about going inside.
Eric, it's David. Are you okay?
I shouted, trying my best to be heard over the storm, but nothing was said in return. Moving inside, I was cautious of where I was stepping in the dark, the house a mere image of the world outside, the ferocity inverted. The space was still and lifeless.
Eric!
I shouted again. A door creaked along the hallway from me, and so, phone light in hand, I made my way towards the living room where we had spoken before. The 2 chairs in which we had sat now lay empty. The glass of water which Eric had drunk from taking his pills lay on the side, the remnants of the water dripping onto the floor. I was about to shout Eric's name for a 3rd time, but something stayed my tongue. A feeling that someone was watching me. Footsteps now quickly sounded behind me. They rushed down the hall, and then they were accompanied by the sound of a door opening. Turning to the hallway, I couldn't see anyone there, but now something had changed. A door halfway along the wall was now open.
Eric!
I whispered under my breath, almost scared by the idea of what might answer. I cannot explain the irrational thoughts which were running through my mind, clamoring for images and forms while surrounded by the nothingness of night. Mentally filling the void with something tangible. Walking towards the door slowly, I peered around it and saw that it led down into the cellar. A steep set of wooden stairs delved below the house. Eric! Are you there? Eric, are you there? I finally said, my voice louder this time. I thought I heard an almost inaudible creak below, but it was quickly drowned out by another crash of thunder. The wind howled like a banshee, finding cracks in the building through which to seep, and I was gripped by uncertainty. I could have ran, or at the very least stayed upstairs. Perhaps I should have, but the gnawing image of Eric cowering, terrified below, was enough to shake me into action. I resented him for what he did to me, for taking Alia from me, but I knew how debilitating his illness was, and I could not in good conscience leave him to it, or it to him. Warily, I descended the stairs, knocking the dust from them as I did so. They were evidently rarely trodden, but there was no doubt that Eric had used them recently, perhaps just moments before, as I could see large smudges and patches of dust which looked like footprints on each step. My own footsteps sounded like dim remnants of the thunder outside, with the dark storm of the unknown waiting for me at the foot of the stairs. Lightning clattered near the house again, the momentary spark shining through a small vent near the roof of the cellar. The light on my mobile phone was not enough to illuminate the entirety of the room, but from what I could see, I was amazed how empty it was. The floor was like powdered concrete, the occasional cardboard box sitting upon it, filled with childhood memories and toys. A thick layer of dust covered the little that was there. It was clear then that the cellar had never been converted into a habitable part of the house, and there should have been no one down there, good or bad. But the sight of a darkened doorway in front of me filled me with dread no less. Ducking underneath, I found myself in another empty room, the walls made from old reddened brick, but the color was dampened by the dust. The cellar was a copy of the house above, like a dark twin. The same layout, the same rooms, the same hallway at the center. But while the house above was filled with things of the living, the cellar was filled with their absence. "Eric?" I whispered now. I'm not sure why. I've never been one to be frightened of the dark. Not since I was a child. But down there in the darkness, while lightning crackled high up in the atmosphere, I felt justified in my caution. The sound of a foot scuffling the powdered concrete floor sent a cold shiver through my veins. Apprehension took a hold of me, and a deep desire to go back upstairs threatened to overthrow any notion of finding or helping Eric. A self-preservation which, like the dust hanging in the air, blanketed my emotions. My heart raced, my breathing rasped as I inhaled the dust, moving in a panic. I headed back to the stairs. At least, that was my intention. For a moment, caught in the grip of anxiety, I became disoriented. Turning, I could see 2 doorways, and I was unsure which one I had come through. Staring at them anxiously, I tried to set my thinking on a more sensible course. All I had to do was walk through one of the doorways. If I found myself in an unfamiliar part of the cellar, I would turn and go back through the other door. Then it felt as though the air became charged, like the tense warning before a lightning storm. My skin turned to goosebumps, and, reaching up, I could feel the hair on the back of my head standing on end from the static electricity. My attention momentarily distracted from the 2 doorways. It was quickly brought back into focus, when, from one of the rooms ahead, I heard it. A voice, in a barely audible whisper, where I could hear more breath and saliva in the mouth than speech. Someone spoke 2 words, but they were so indistinct that I could not be sure what they were, nor even if they had just been a figment of my imagination, a product of my strange surroundings. Whether it was because of Eric's story or not, I cannot say, but the only phrase I could fit to those 2 whispered sounds was, "Down here." A cold sweat clung to my body, and a nervousness gripped me as my hand began to shake while holding the phone. The light from it vibrated in return, and I stood for what felt like a lifetime staring at the 2 doorways. Which one contained the voice? Which one contained my path to freedom? Excitement then grew as I remembered the powdered concrete at my feet. Looking down, the blue light from the phone dimly lit smudged markings on the floor, which I was certain were my own. They led back through the doorway on the right. Feeling courage return, I stepped through, and in a moment of utter shock, I realized that the markings were not made by me. They were made by someone else. I found myself in an unfamiliar part of the cellar and turned immediately to leave. When I did so, it all happened so fast. My light caught something in front of me, a person or a form. It moved past me and headed through another doorway, and then I heard a scream, Eric's scream. "It's here!" he shrieked, manic, clearly in the throes of his delusion. I followed quickly and then heard panicked footsteps accompanying the cries, which now turned to a plea, a direct plea to me. "Follow it! David, it's here!" The footsteps now ran up the staircase, and as they did, I noticed that the charged feeling in the atmosphere dissipated. The lightning must have struck elsewhere. The feeling of dread lifted, and then it was replaced with a different kind of anxiety. Up above, I heard Eric run down the hallway and out into the night, screaming, "I see it! I see it!" clamoring through the cellar. I finally found the staircase, and, relieved that I was leaving the dark place behind, rushed up them in pursuit of my friend. I gave chase and headed out into the night. The rain was coming down in sheets, and above, the lightning and thunder coerced each other into terrifying displays of combined might, but there was no sign of Eric in the garden. The water streamed down my face, making it difficult to see as the wind battered me from left to right, a swirling, invisible force intent on leaving no stone unturned. Rushing out to the street, I looked again, and at the top of the hill, some way away, I saw him. Eric was running through the night. He had too much of a head start, and in any case was faster. I would never catch him on my feet. A gust of wind and rain buffeted me around before I finally reached my car and got inside. Turning the ignition, the engine burst into life, growling as if threatened by the storm. Putting my foot down, I drove up the street in his direction. It would only take me seconds to catch up to him, even in that damned weather, but the night had other plans. I was gaining, but just as I reached within a few feet of him, ready to stop and pull him into my car, a painful creak shrieked nearby, the groan of life ending. A tree which had stood for at least 100 years fell, crashing in front of me. Instinctively, my foot slammed on the brakes. I felt a thump as the front of my car smashed into the tree trunk lying before me. A large branch jutted out, and as I crashed, it smashed through the windscreen. I saw it for a second before and hid under the dashboard. My heart pounding, the glass shattered above me. The wind and rain broke into the car like a swarm of rats, climbing through the open wound in the front of the vehicle. Disoriented, I opened the door to my right and fell face first onto the road. The concrete surface gushed with water, carrying with it leaves and dirt. As I hit the ground, the water splashed up into my mouth, and I gasped and coughed as some stuck in my windpipe. Lightning shattered the sky, and the thunder raged as I caught my breath. Pulling myself to my feet, I looked at the car. It was caught in the clutches of the falling tree, the branches enveloping it. Steam rose from somewhere, and the engine answered my cough with one of its own. And even then, I was not sure it could be salvaged. Any feelings of grief from my car quickly wiped away as the squall of wind wrenched at the garden fence across from me. It tore several wood slats from their housing and launched them further down the street. A lamppost above rattled in the wind, its light still extinguished. And I feared that it too would topple, crushing me in the process. It was too dangerous. I had to get back to Eric's house and out of the storm. I guess I felt more for Eric than I could admit to myself that night, even after everything he had done to me. I saw up ahead through the storm, the rain lashing further along the streets, heading deeper into the storm. Something indistinct then flew through the air, carried on the wind. At least, it appeared that way. Perhaps it was a plastic bag, or no, a piece of cloth? Whatever it was, it weaved and darted through the rain, and I watched as Eric waved his hands above him, trying to batter it away. The object must have carried more weight than at first appeared. As it struck Eric on the head, he fell to the ground, and the object continued on its way, carried by the fierceness of the night. I could not leave him lying on the road, so I climbed over the fallen tree and ran along the streets toward him. The wind blew in my face, and as it did so, I found it almost impossible to breathe, turning my head to the side just to inhale barely enough air to continue. As I approached Eric in the dim light of my phone, I saw a cut on his unconscious head, blood trickling from it. Leaning down, I reached out in an attempt to wake him, but as I did so, he opened his eyes and let out a hideous scream, a sort of panicked cry like a child seeing something awful under its bed. His arms flailed as he pushed me back. "Eric, it's me, David!" I yelled. The thunder drowned out my voice. "Eric, we need to get back to the house!" I could barely hear my own voice, and I imagined that for Eric it was a nightmarish scene, waking up disoriented, seeing your friend above you, the lightning illuminating his face as his mouth opened and shut without apparently conveying any meaning. He lashed out, striking me on the nose. I fell to my knees for a moment, dazed, as he climbed to his feet and dashed off into the night. "Eric, no!" I felt myself say under my breath. It was madness which has gripped him, madness to follow, but follow I did. I ran down the street as the hill now descended on the other side, then through a small wood across from the primary school we had both attended as children. Finally, I struggled across Kings Park Avenue, a long street usually bustling with traffic, now doused with darkness, rain, and dread. And there we were, on Station Road, the bridge which crossed above Kings Park train station, that innocuous little place where all of this began. Eric stopped for a moment in the middle of the empty road. Whether it was terror or confusion, I couldn't really tell, but it was as if he was waiting for something to happen, perhaps hoping for evidence of the thing under the bridge which he believed had been haunting him. I saw nothing but the raging storm. Tilting his head as if he heard something, as if you could in that storm, he suddenly ran to the staircase which led steeply down to the station. I followed as quickly as I could, still gasping for air, fighting the wind which threw itself with all its might against me. Reaching the stairs, I saw Eric below me on the platform, peering across the train line to the half-archway under the bridge. "Eric!" I screamed again, this time a momentary lapse of thunder allowing my voice to be heard. He looked up at me, and pointed across the train tracks to the half-tunnel. I shook my head. "No, Eric! Please! We need to get out of here!" But he paid no heed to my words, if he heard them at all. He dashed across the platform, rushing to the bottom of the stairs. I was helpless to stop him. By the time I reached the platform, he had already climbed down from it onto the tracks and was making his way across them to the underside of the bridge. Above the line, the power cable swayed aggressively in the wind like necrotic veins, and a cold feeling now passed through my body. How I wished I had rushed across the tracks to stop my friend immediately, but I could not. Something gripped me. A fear like no other, something primal, like the terror which spiders and snakes elicit automatically, even from those who have never encountered such creatures. It felt as though we are not alone, and whatever accompanied us was something which should not have been seen. Eric pushed on. I watched as he reached the other side of the tracks. Standing before him was the half-tunnel, its mouth gaping and dark. Yes, that was it. That place was darker than anything around it. A place not fit for people. Perhaps fit for something else. Something inhuman. That irrational thought finally spurred me into action. Jumping from the platform, I peered down the train line which continued for miles vacantly. Then I rushed across them to my friend. The thunder and lightning coalesced once more, and as it did so, Eric stepped into the half-tunnel. I moved forward, the gaping maw of it seeming bigger somehow than I remember. Once again, the paralysis of that strange fear, that uncanny feeling of otherness took me, and so I stood for a moment, waiting. My only company, the howling wind and seething trees on the side of the tracks as they spasmed rhythmically with the storm. I could not see inside, nor could I see any trace of Eric. It was as if he'd entered into another plane, another place, and vanished, to a Stygian abyss in which human beings were not meant to wander. I tried desperately to free myself from Eric's own delusion as I stared at the nothingness of the half-archway, but I could not help but question what was meant by the two words which had started it all. Down here. A hand reached out from the darkness and grabbed hold of me. Eric's drawn face appeared, and he pushed me down the embankment. I tumbled and fell to the track, my chin and shoulder crushing against the cold, wet metal of the train track. Above me, Eric stood, his eyes wide and bright, but his face etched in terror. He said something, and the elements covered it like a shroud. "What?" I said, standing up, feeling blood gushing from my chin. He spoke again, this time more fervently, but again I could not hear him for the storm. Rushing forward, he pushed me away again, pointing at the stairs to the road above. He screamed and yelled, his arms flailing, glancing back several times to the mouth of the half-tunnel, but I could not hear him. All I could see was the fear in his face. For the last time, he pointed back to the half-archway. Lightning crackled. And did I see something inside? Was it illuminated by the light just for a moment? The shape? The shadow? I could not be certain. Something cracked nearby, and the sound of wood splintering. Eric pushed me out of the way as a large tree from the embankment above gave way, falling several feet from him. I watched in horror as the tree cut through the power lines above, cut through them in sparks of electric blue, and then swallowed Eric whole. I saw it. The main trunk hitting him, crushing him into the ground. The power lines flailed around, thousands of volts emanating from them, the electricity like an enraged prisoner unleashed. If they touched me, I was dead. Instinctively, I pulled myself quickly back onto the platform and fell onto my hands and knees, scrambling away. Turning back, I watched as the power line smoked and growled. Somewhere under it all, Eric's body lay. I called for an ambulance, and for the fire brigade. I guess they were busy that night with the storm and the havoc it caused around the city. It took nearly an hour for them to arrive. By that time, the wind and rain were calming. The thunder and lightning still sounded, but now miles away on the horizon, like a ferocious animal moving on, well-fed and sated. After the power lines had been shut off, I watched as the firefighters sifted through the smoking embers of the tree, watched as they finally lifted the tree trunk off of the line, and discovered the pulverized body of Eric. He had been burnt to a crisp from the electricity. Whether it was that which had finished him off or the impact from the tree, I did not know. All I do know is that now he is gone. My old friend. I often tell people that it was his illness that killed him, that the hallucinations were too much for anyone to cope with. They believe me, though I wonder sometimes if I believe myself. I'll conclude my account by simply saying this. Sanity is a fleeting, temporary condition. All of our delusions are ideas of how the world works and what constitutes reality, but such things are not concrete. They are merely interpretations of what the world truly is, a shadow of the universe, an echo of what is really there, a facsimile put together by our brains collecting data from our unreliable senses. In this way, we are always removed from the truth, staring out from behind the warped glass of our own eyes. Who knows what the world is actually made of, and what is contained within it? For Eric, whatever he heard, whatever he saw, it was real for him, real enough to make him believe something far removed from the ordinary, something most people are not meant to see. For myself, I truly hope that such a revelation is kept far away, and that the world remains understood, calculated, and known. I choose to believe that what Eric saw was not objectively real. Despite this belief, I have never visited the station at King's Park since that night, for in my weaker moments I fear that I may hear those same those two words, real or imagined, which led my friend to the dark recesses of the human mind, where our own personal monsters lie in wait, ravenous, and ready to make themselves known. I hope you enjoyed this story and the music that I composed for it. If you did, make sure to like the video and leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to see in future videos. And if you didn't, let me know what you think I can do to improve my narrations or videos. And make sure to look in the description for the author information so you can see more of their work if you'd like. With that said, have a good night.
Whoever's here, please make yourself known because I'm just gonna end the stream. I think I'm talking to myself right now. I don't freaking know. Why? Hi, yeah, sorry, give me a second. Hi, so I have a friend. Sorry, I need that ambulance, please, for a friend, potentially. Yeah, she's still breathing. Yeah, she is. Alright, so my friend contacted me a bit ago. She's saying that she wanted to commit suicide, so she took propanolol. But a lot of it, she's at Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester right now. Overdose, it seems. It's at Pic. I don't know the full address. She just said she's at Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester. Oh god damn it. Sorry, give me a second. Come on, come on.